Hey, it's Jen. Before we get to today's episode of Within Orb, I wanted to tell you about something new at CAELi, which is Time Climb. Think of it like a exercise gym for your astrology brain, in a way. If you love the conversations that you hear on Within Orb every week, you can have them with me live in this lab, which happens every other Saturday, starting on October 19th. And if you're a paying member of CAELi, you get in. And if you're not, sign up now because Time Climb is beginning. And really, the best way to become better at astrology is to have these free-flowing, advanced conversations where you don't really know where it's going to go, but you know it's going to go somewhere good. So I'm inviting you to come to Time Climb at CAELi and join me in conversation every other week. So there'll be information about this in the show notes, and enjoy today's episode. The Within Orb Podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today we are heading down south to New Mexico, one of my favorite states, but I do have some significant astrocartography lines there and some lovely childhood memories from there. We are crawling into the mountains near Taos to visit Rose Blakelock. Rose, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on and learn all about the books that have shaped your life and love of astrology. So let's just get right into it. What was your first astrology book?
The first one I can remember was this book, Sextrology by Starsky and Cox. Did you ever read that?
I had that in my collection. It wasn't my first, but it definitely caught my eye. You can't miss it on the store shelf.
It's true. And I guess to be fair, I think there was a copy of Linda Goodman's Love Signs lying around at my parents' house that I peeked through but didn't really understand.
Yeah. I mean, with a title like Sextrology or even Love Signs, right? That'll get you in your teens, won't it?
Yeah, it sure will. And I remember just feeling very salacious, paging through it. I would go to Barnes and Noble with my friend and we would pull up into a corner and read. I don't think I bought it for 2 years, but I would just go and read through it over a period of 6 or 8 months as soon as we got our driver's license. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's worse things you could be doing, right?
True. Yes. And I was also doing those, but that's not what we're here to talk about.
That's so funny because whenever anyone asks me, how'd you get into astrology? I'm like, well, I got grounded, but we're not going to talk about that. So it sounds like you had sort of a similar entry point.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Very good. Very good. Okay. So what was it, though, about astrology that gripped you? Because you're an astrologer now. You have a podcast. You've got all kinds of client work that you do. I mean, you're kind of fully active in the profession. So what got you?
Wow, what a good question. I kind of grew up steeped in it. My parents were hippies. I remember my dad, when I was 4, telling me that the reason that my ankle hurt was because I'm an Aquarius sun. And yeah.
So comforting.
Yeah, it didn't really help in the moment. But I think what I appreciate is that I sometimes have trouble staying focused or interested in something. And it is something that for more than 20 years, has gripped me. And I think that the balance of a prescribed fate, but also agency that a good astrologer and a good practice will give you is really interesting. And I also just couldn't ignore the synchronicity. I couldn't ignore, the first time I had an actual reading, feeling seen in a way that I never had and feeling like I had more choice than I ever thought I did, which is maybe ironic considering that in some ways we're telling people that parts of their lives are fated, right? But I never got bored and I'm still not bored. And I feel like there's always more to learn and develop. And it's also just a really wonderful way to connect with people.
Yeah, never enough time to study it all. There's so much. But let's pretend that you get a chance to get away and you can only take 3 astrology books with you. And you have an ephemeris in your pocket because, what good astrologer doesn't? Because that's fascinating anyway by itself. But yes. You have 3 books in your satchel. What are your picks?
Ooh, it's a tough one. I think Definitely an astrological triptych by Dane Rudhyar, which has 3 portions, right? He's basically rewriting his understanding of the signs of the zodiac, the houses in a natal chart, and also the planets and their influence. And my brain doesn't always hold on to things. So I feel like I could just reread that over and over again. And so that's kind of 3 books in one.
Yeah. Oh, so you're cheating. Okay.
But if I'm allowed to choose more.
Yes. No, that's it. You got it. I mean, some people had 3 books on life and that's it, No, I'm kidding. No, let's stick with the triptych for a minute. So rewriting, like what is the revision here? What is the thing about Rudhyar's work that is offering something new in your mind?
Well, I think on the one hand, he literally in that collection rewrote his own understanding, right? Because he has certainly his own treatise on the planets and on the astrological houses, which was the first time the houses made sense to me was reading his book, The Astrological Houses. But I think there's something about him, and you'll have to confirm or deny that he's perhaps a fellow 12th houser as I am.
I have not studied his chart in depth, but we could look it up.
Yeah, it's like there's definitely some Neptunian stuff, some Piscean stuff, which like I heavily relate to. And I think that he's concerned in this with really coming to a fulfilling conclusion. Like he's really trying to weave in all of his years of study and understanding and talking and writing about astrology so that he can like leave something succinct and satisfying. And I think that that is really interesting. Like I really love watching people's understanding grow and develop and watching them say something and then say it again and then say it again. And there's something about the distillation process that I feel like is really apparent in that book, in that trilogy in particular, where it's like you could actually go through that book and just read the last paragraph of every section and just be like I just made my brain explode with my hand. That's what that sound was.
Mind blown.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, he did have this musical life. I think, an episode with Lars Panaro, we talked about that. Mm-hmm. Dane's relationship to music and philosophy informing his astrological practice. And I think that lifelong engagement with these cycles and rhythms and patterns, leads to that. But your word distillation is really beautiful.
Thanks.
And the word triptych is like a painting, isn't it?
It is, right? It's 3 scenes, I think, that are connected. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I remember seeing a triptych of Grunewald in this place called Colmar in Germany, or actually it's on the border of France. I think it's technically inside France. And it was one of the first depictions of Jesus as a diseased figure, distorted figure. But you have this panels showing him in the crucifixion. Nevertheless, back to when I hear triptych, I think of that, So
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I have more books to say, huh?
Yeah, I mean, the triptych sounds like you're going to be spending time reading and rereading and letting the poetry of Rudhyar's prose kind of wash over your mind, blow your mind, and then you got to put your mind back together and get it blown again.
It's true. And I guess for like a more pragmatic option, the Transits of Midlife and Aging by Erin Sullivan,
mm-hmm.
I feel like particularly in this moment, it's great. There's lots of younger folks who are really interested. And also, sure, Saturn returns, big deal. Sure, let's talk about perfection years and let's talk about even like the midlife transits that are more commonly known, right? Pluto square, Neptune square, Uranus opposition. But to dig deeper into the series of Jupiter returns and those cycles, the closing Uranus square, I don't know. I want those tools. And also, if I'm alone on a desert island, I'm going to be getting older too, right? So
I have this fatalistic, I'm never getting off this island, so...
Oh, is it a vacation?
Well, I mean, sometimes people take the pick-a-trick so they can actually elect a time to try to get help and leave.
I'm just assuming I'm there forever, so I'm going to need some tools.
Oh my God, that's awesome. Yeah, no, I think that this is an overlooked, I mean, it's an excellent choice, honestly, and may Erin rest in peace, she recently passed. But there are so many people who would write to the Mountain Astrologer saying, I want to know about the 3rd Saturn return. I want to know about, like you just said, the closing square of Uranus to itself. And there aren't yet a lot of books that go into that in great depth. And so this is a really great classic of that type of, examination.
Yeah, thank you.
So when you're looking through Erin's work, what are some of the takeaways you get with her description of the factors of midlife and aging in astrology?
That you don't have to stop growing and making choices to become more yourself just because you're past 45, which I feel like there is kind of this sentiment or this lack of emphasis or focus. And as my clientele grows, I have plenty of folks who I talk to who are in their 50s and their 60s. And part of me is like, what could I tell you about anything, right?
Yeah.
There is a sense that like, how can I tell you how to cope with things that I have not gotten to yet? But having that wealth of experience and that kind of pragmatic breakdown, I also really, even though I won't take it with me to the desert island, I do really love her book about Saturn and its transits and the way it moves around the chart. And I find myself referencing that a lot as well. I just appreciate that she is interested in talking about maybe the less glamorous or less emphasized parts of living, growing, aging, and evolving.
Yeah, that is a really powerful toolkit to add to your larger astrological toolkit, only because as we go through our lives, the people that we're speaking with will be getting older and older, some younger and younger, obviously, but to overlook that population, I think, is a disservice. And also this fantasy, right, of, oh, you've crested, you've gotten your biological purpose fulfilled, maybe, if you're choosing to do that. And now what? It's like the stages of development from 0 to 45 are so much rapid change in the human body. And then from 45 on, you're kind of not going to be like, getting a new set of teeth or going through puberty at that point. I think that's why the Ptolemaic ages of man, you have all of these faster planets ruling. And then by the time you get to the 60s or, by the end of the 50s, it's just Saturn for the rest of your time. It's just like Saturn from here on out. That's it. You got it. But I do think, I've seen it with, and I'd love to ask you this too as well, because it's like the ones who are going through the decade of the 50s, the second Saturn return is coming up and they've got a lot of like things to work through. And then you get to the 60s and it really is the golden years. Like there is something that shifts completely. And even the 64, like you just get this beautiful shift. And it's like, I'm so excited to tell people in their 50s, just wait till you're in your 60s. It's going to be so good. And obviously lives and charts are slightly different. So you can't just promise that as a blanket rule. But more often than not, I see that, Do you see that too?
I do, and it almost feels like the shift to this Jupiterian energy, and not in a like, I have endless opportunity, but in a, I am kind of freed from certain bonds. Like I see a lot more optimism and goodwill, even hand in hand or side by side with an aging and deteriorating body, with a recognition of like, I only have so much time left. There is kind of this buoyancy if you make it through that second Saturn return and you're happy with your choices.
Yeah,
it's interesting, which I guess 60 is a Jupiter return. And then, you're building to early 60s and is that Uranus closing square, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think that can still be kind of liberating if you've pushed through all this tension of the Saturn square and opposition and Saturn return. You're kind of like, well, all right, I know the choices I've made.
Yeah, I have some friends in Bristol who are amazing, not astrologers, but they are in their 60s and they have the coolest loft. It's also an art studio. It's also a gallery. It's it's just the most incredible thing. And then they go to poetry readings, they write, they're like living their best lives and their kids are, in their 30s now and they're beginning to be grandparents and going, oh, this is sort of like everything you wanted at the opening Uranus square, but now you have you've done your job, you've paid your dues, and now you get to have all the fun before the really hardcore aging process kicks in. And I was like, I can't wait to be in my 60s, honestly. Like, that sounds like it's going to be an amazing time,
Yeah. And I think part of it is perspective too, right? It's like, you really know what's a big deal and what's not.
Yeah.
And I think that's huge for a lot of us.
Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. So what would your third book be?
Sue Tompkins, Aspects in Astrology. I still go back to that. That's what first helped me understand how planets talk to each other by kind of, simplifying it, stripping it down. Sue's approach is like, depending on the planets, conjunctions can be useful or not, but a square and an opposition going to hold a lot of the same tension. Sextiles and trines are going to relieve some friction, right? Are going to give some ease. And so that let me really focus on the planets and their natures, because, it can get so overcomplicated if you're trying to look at a planet in a sign, in a house, in aspect. And sure, those add different flavors and certainly should impact your interpretation. But to get to kind of the core signification and the way that these different energies interact with each other really, really helped me feel like I could learn how to do this. When I first started doing readings, I used to keep that book with me, and I would look at people's charts and be like, well, what does Sue say about Pluto Moon? What does Sue say?
Yeah.
And then you have to reach that point where you're not writing a research paper for every reading, where you kind of put your sources aside and let your own interpretation come through. But I feel like she's so clear and so articulate and also so dense. Like, I really appreciate that book. And I feel like it's a real gift that keeps giving. Like, I'm sure if I went back, I would get new shades and flavors. And then I could add what I've learned and seen in session with people to that and kind of let them meld in a way that I haven't looked at it in a while. So I feel like if I had some time, maybe I'll get off the island. Maybe I won't. But I'll take that book.
Okay. Were there any aspects that you read that really were ones that you've always stuck with, like even without having to grab the book, where you just like at a conference or something or in a local group and you're talking about astrology and someone drops, 2 planets together and you're like, ooh, Sue said this about those planets?
I mean, Pluto Moon, honestly. And this intensity and like deep yearning for closeness, and also this fear of being kind of consumed or annihilated by it. I feel like that is anytime somebody's chart comes my way and it's got Pluto Moon, I'm like, I remember. I cannot forget it. I would say that that's the one that stuck with me the most. And that is the thing that, it's a very significant, intense aspect.
How would you talk to a client about that?
I would first just ask them about their kind of foundational experiences of nurturance and intimacy, right? Because I try to build and base everything. Like, I don't want to plant a boogeyman where there isn't one. Like, if somebody instead is just like, yeah, I don't know, I have a very strong, intense psychic bond with my nurturing parent, or is like, they weren't even around, or they consumed me. I don't know. But yeah, really kind of any Pluto placement, I don't want to plant a seed of terror where there isn't one.
Yeah, I know I had a case where someone had a Mars-Pluto conjunction in the 4th, and everybody, who'd seen that chart was like, oh, and I'm like, it's an athlete. It's somebody who just likes to run. It's not abuse. It's not violence. It's not all the things you could imagine with a Pluto Mars conjunction. Is like, it's just really hardcore, like NCAA level athletics.
Yeah.
And it's not any more or less than that.
Right.
So, you do have to get the client to meet you halfway.
Yeah. I had a friend who got a reading from Lynn Bell and had Pluto in the 4th house. And opening question, Lynn was like, who's the monster in the basement?
Whoa.
She wasn't wrong.
Not wrong, but yow, that's a way to begin. Right?
Yeah, quite an opener.
Yeah. Well, who's the monster in the basement? Well, then, where's the monster in the whatever house Pluto's in?
Yeah.
Maybe. But maybe the monster's like the Alice in Wonderland. I always liked, I think it was Michael Luton, who said that Pluto makes big things small and small things big.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that's a super important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at Pluto touching stuff, because it's the total Alice in Wonderland, like the athlete with Pluto on Mars. It's like, this was not a huge, horrible monster. This was literally just like, I'm going to be a pro.
Well, and then you also though see that intensity, right?
Yeah.
That like willpower, that like, because it's also survival stuff, right? And so it's like, and with Mars, it's like, okay, I'm going to be really competitive and really intense and need a lot of like
winning.
Yeah, I need to win. I must win. Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God. So what would Saturn-Pluto be then? Need a lot of authority, structure.
Yeah, I need a lot of authority. I desperately want to mature.
I want to grow up. I want to be old before I'm young.
Or I have really intense boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. All right.
Interesting.
Sue Tompkins, aspects in astrology.
Bless her.
All right. So do you teach?
I do sometimes. I'm still trying to figure out how that looks in these changing times. And, people have growing and diminishing tolerance to be on screens. And I live very far from a lot of people.
Yeah. Zoom fatigue is a thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was so funny when the pandemic unleashed itself onto the world and everybody got online and I'm like, I've been here for years, you guys. Welcome to the world that I live in. And now it's the new normal. And I'm like, wait, can you go back? I liked it when it was not so
proliferated.
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful thing to connect people. It's sad that it's become fatiguing.
Yeah, it is. But there's some things that translate really well. And some things that don't. And so my hope is that things get resorted or redistributed in that way where folks can get what they need, not on the screen, and we can teach people about astrology and talk to them about it on it if that's what we need.
So if someone were going to come to you and say, where should I get started? Do you have books you'd recommend to them?
Yeah, definitely. Horoscope Symbols, I always want to call it Horoscope and Symbols, but yeah, there it is.
I actually happen to have Horoscope Symbols right next to me here. It's a nice, very clean copy, but usually they're dog-eared and very leafed through by Robert Hand.
Yes, by Robert Hand. It's a good primer. And there's one section where after he finishes going through and describing the houses in the order that we know them, he actually is like, wouldn't it be fun if we actually inverted it the way that the planets travel through the sky and go through them backwards? And I really appreciate that. Yes, I love Dane Rudhyar, and also I feel like Robert Hand writes very plainly, and I don't mean that as a dig. I actually mean that it's very readable, it's digestible, and I think if you're just starting out and trying to get your footing and figure out what is even going on here, how do I possibly start to pick apart this thousands and thousands year old practice and make sense of it and find a way to approach it, I think it's indispensable as a resource.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard from people who've worked with him. I've worked on his work as well at the Sophia Center Press, and he writes like he talks and he talks like he writes. So if you go to his lectures at NORWAC or even UAC or whatever, and you're like, what did he say? It's like you have to pretend you're reading. You have to close your eyes and just kind of listen and be like, oh, right, I can imagine this being an article. But then when you're reading the article, you can hear his voice in your head. Mm-hmm. It transcends that.
Yeah. So I really appreciate him. And I have a thing for like curmudgeons. And I've listened to some recent interviews with him where he's like, he knows what he knows. And he's also a little tired of these rascals. And you're kind of like, oh, I love that kind of grump.
I disagree. Did you see his recent conversation with Deb Holding about house systems?
That's actually what I'm referencing.
You know what my favorite part of that is? The end when they make a pun on their names, holding hand. It's the best.
It's good. It's good.
Yeah. Everybody get together now. Okay. What other books would you recommend for beginners?
I did mention it earlier, but The Astrological Houses by Dane Rudhyar, which is hard to get a hold of because it's out of print. So you can't get a new copy.
It's here at CAELi.
Oh, it is.
I have multiple copies, multiple print editions.
Yeah. I mean, I have one, maybe two copies, but then also you can get it used anywhere.
Yeah.
But that for me, I mean, the lunation cycle and the astrological houses are both really great, but I think that the astrological houses is easier to read and understand. And Dane Rudhyar's description of the houses as they unfold he likens it to natural processes. And I love this thought of like, the seed, the roots, the flower, the fruit, right? As you go through and hit all the angles. And this idea that we're like an acorn, right? Like each one of us, each of our natal charts holds a potential that is just unfolding over time as we grow and mature. And we are never not becoming who we are supposed to be. And this is how we get there. It's pretty overwhelming to try to figure out the houses, I think. I think a lot of folks can resonate with the zodiac signs, can figure out the planets, but the houses, it's like, okay, so anything that happens has to get divided into this. How do I figure out, like, what's the sorting system? And I feel like that book does a really good job of getting to kind of the core meaning or significance of each house, which gives you a blueprint or a roadmap to follow, right? Where you're like, okay, I can understand these other extrapolations. I can understand why money is here, but so is self-esteem, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So I really appreciate that slim volume. And I think some of his best work is like, I'm holding my hand up. It's like a half an inch thick. Like it's not, it's potent and it's kind of dense, but it also is poetic and really resonates. It sticks with you, I think.
Yeah. And learning the houses is definitely a challenge because sometimes people go, oh my gosh, I have an empty area. What does it mean? Look at that part of the chart that's got nothing in it. Am I doomed? And it's like, no. I think of it actually as sometimes a blessing because, I mean, if you think about the perfect chart with no planets in it, pretend there's no solar system. It's like a perfect white plate, right? And then you get a toothbrush with some mud on it and you like flick it onto the plate. That's your planets in your chart, right? Like it's little snags, little mud puddles. Like, got to deal with this Saturn here and that Mercury over there. Clean it up, So you don't want the splatters in those houses. You want to keep it clean.
I mean, yeah, you might not have Jupiter and Venus conjunct in that house, but you also don't have Saturn and Pluto there too. So
yeah, exactly. So when I was in an astrological library, one book fell off the shelf at me about elemental voids by Shirley Lyons Meyer.
Ooh.
And in it, she said that having no planets placed in an element of the zodiac means that you're actually a master of that element and not necessarily a person who has like got a void of that element, right? So people will be like, oh, I have no planets in air. I have an air void. And they identify with this like lack of air, but it's actually a mastery, right? So and then it led me to think of planets as these snags or as these kind of problems that we're dealing with, where it's like, oh, your homework is this Saturn in Virgo, right? Like, sorry for you. You've got to deal with that. But we all have them somewhere. Mars is always going to be somewhere. Oh, I got Mars down there with Pluto in the 4th house. Got to deal with that monster, right? But having something kind of free from that is a little bit of a like, oh, hey, got off scot-free with that 11th house. Don't have to worry about that this lifetime, right? Or it's handled somewhere else. It's like coming through a different area. So I think of that way that we can see things. Like when we see something, we're going, ooh, and it's like, what about the things that like the blank spaces? They're worth looking at too,
Yeah. I really like that idea that like, you've already figured this out. Sure, some people come and get a reading because they're doing really great and everything's fine, right?
Yeah,
but most
people.
But most people come because they're struggling in some way or they're trying to make sense of what's going on for them and also trying to figure out when it's going to be over, right? So to be able to offer somebody that kind of relief, like, oh, this just means you know how to do that. Don't worry about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like that.
There's nothing going through there. You're good. Or, something progresses in there and it's like, comes time for your lesson.
No?
Here's your homework. Cool. All right. So any other books you would put in the hands of a beginner?
The Astrology of Fate by Liz Greene. It's hard for me to choose just a few because then I'm like, is that too complicated? Yeah. Maybe I'd actually rather give them aspects in astrology. Maybe I'd give them Tracy Marks' Art of Chart Interpretation. But I think that it's just as important kind of foundationally to really wrestle with this question of fate before you sit with somebody and tell them what you think's happening for them. And, Liz Greene, she's a Jungian, right? Like, loves that guy. And some of us have some feelings. And also, I do think that this idea of us meeting fate, that there's certain circumstances and paths that are prescribed, and yet we also do always have a choice, whether our only choice is to joyfully accept our fate, as Jung implies, or to find a different way to act it out. I think that you can really help people in this profession, and I think you can really cause a lot of harm too, particularly if you make people feel trapped and if you strip people of their agency. And I just think she's so smart. She weaves together so many different fields and realms of experience, and she takes so seriously the responsibility of an astrologer that I think that some emphasis should be placed upon, like, all right, what do we think about fate? What are we really telling somebody when we say this is your chart and these are the planets? And how are we approaching that to help people feel like they can make choices in their lives?
Yeah, you got to have that foundation or that philosophical position clarified. And also, maybe, do you think that that book would help the person who's about to enter the field as a practitioner sort out their own potential, like, projection or dealing with, things that they see and they're saying it, but it's not really there. It's something that they just need to work on a little bit. Because I know that with Liz's trainings with the Center for Psychological Astrology, people had to go through analysis while they were also going to be astrologers and work on their own material.
I was just thinking about that. Like, before you said it, I was like, gotta talk about this piece.
Yeah.
And she and Howard Sasportas, right, had that lecture series that then got transcribed, which is also really wonderful. If I was allowed to give 6 books, I would also say, like, please look at the inner planets and the luminaries. And then I actually prefer Howard Sasportas, The Gods of Change, for figuring out outer planet stuff. I mean, their lecture series is still good, but sometimes it just gets a little weird reading a transcript.
Yeah, and I wonder how those things will last the test of time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the conversations seem a little dated, like, you said that in public?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Which I also should make a footnote for that Dane Rudhyar recommendation. I forgot that he uses he for everything.
Oh, yeah.
And he also is a Christian mystic, so he's also like, there's a lot of God in the second part of the astrological triptych. But, many of us, those of us who are women, those of us who are queer, those of us who are otherwise kind of marginalized or minoritized groups, we are used to having to switch pronouns, judge things, find a way to actually place ourselves in that position, whether or not it's written with us in mind.
You just gave me an idea for a positive use of AI, which would be to say, take this book by Dane Rudhyar and correct the pronouns and maybe nip and tuck some of the God stuff and tell me what he's really saying here.
Totally. Just make it spirit. Like, he talks about spirit all the time. And I think that leaves a lot more room.
I mean, things are of their time. And I think this work of translation is our job, actually, to sort of say, hey, this is what was going on. And that was that frame. And now this is what's happening now. And produce our own contributions.
Yeah, I think that is in some ways more important than anything, because astrology is a living language and it should be responsive to and reflecting the needs of the time and the folks who are working with it.
Speaking of time, thank you for taking time out of your day to chat with me about the books that have moved you.
Yeah, you're so welcome. It was a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Jen.
Yeah, and where can people find you?
People can find me on Substack at my name, roseblakelock.substack.com. That's probably the best place to keep track of me. I also have a website that's just my name, roseblakelock.com. And then I'm on Instagram at mutablecross, though I spend less and less time there. But yeah. And then I have a podcast called Mutual Reception that folks can check out.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.